Welcome back to part 2 of our discussion of Northern Renaissance painting. In our last segment, we talked about the artist Jan van Eyck, who was really masterful with oil painting and is considered the father of oil painting. We're going to be looking at another work of art by him. This is called the Arnolfini Wedding Portrait. It's very, very famous. I'm sure you've seen it before. And this is on the College Board AP list of your 250 works that you have to know. This painting is a small, full-length double portrait, which is believed to represent the Italian merchant Giovanni di Nicola Arnolfini and possibly his wife. It's believed that the setting is presumably in their home in the Flemish city of Brugge. Arnolfini was from Florence, so he was Italian and relocated to Northern Europe to make a living in the textile trade. 15th century Europe saw the emergence, and we talked about this in the last segment, of merchants whose rise to power was fueled by individual accomplishments rather than hereditary succession with noble families. So that's something else that we're seeing in terms of the shift in economy, and again, this rise of a middle class. The setting is a bedroom scene, and it's, we're talking about the northern part of Europe, which was very cold, so only certain rooms were heated, and so this might be one reason why this portrait takes place in the bedroom, because this would have been obviously a place that would have needed to be heated and kept warm. But it's also been recorded that some people during the 15th century had beds in their living room, and this was sort of a status symbol to show off their wealth. In the composition, we see a female figure, and when you first glance at her, you might think that she is pregnant, just because of the way she's sort of holding the cloth over her belly. She is not. She's wearing very thick clothing, again, because of the cold temperatures in Northern Europe, and she's holding the drapery up towards her belly, perhaps alluding to her fertility. Again, there's a lot of ambiguity about this painting, and there are a lot of different interpretations about it. There is, lots of disguised symbolism, and we will talk about some of those. One thing that we see is fruit on the table in the back over here, and so this could also be interpreted as a symbol for wealth and fertility. Van Eyck used the technique of oil painting in this double portrait. Again, I want to remind you that oil painting was this way of applying different layers, and artists were able to achieve this sort of translucency, and so they had a real intensity with both tone and color, and this really highlighted the realism of the work. And obviously, we see a lot of detail, descriptive detail. Again, this is, it's not linear one-point perspective. Remember, North Renaissance painters weren't interested in that. They were interested in sort of showing as much of the scene as possible, I think, in order to sort of communicate and sort of play around and show off their sort of ability to do this incredible descriptive sort of surface detail in their paintings. So we're going to look at a detail. Some disguised symbolism here are the shoes that have been removed. This perhaps signifies a sacred space. We see a little terrier dog, and a dog is usually a symbol of fidelity, as well as demonstrating, and it's also technically used to sort of, again, demonstrate this elaborate attention to texture that Van Eyck has been able to capture in the dog's fur. When we look at various other parts of the composition, we see, again, this incredible descriptive detail. There's sort of a sheen on the wool garment, the fur trim on Arnolfini's cloak. It really looks so realistic. And again, this was only achieved by the sort of mastery of oil painting. I'm going to also call your attention to, we talked about the fruit on the table, the fruit on the windowsill is an interesting detail that art historians have noted because it's seasonal. This fruit, it would have been harvested during a warm time of year, but the couple is clearly wearing winter clothing, and so this could also have been a way to sort of show off their wealth, that they could afford to have imported fruit. And again, also, we mentioned earlier, the symbol of fecundity and fertility as well. We're going to draw our attention to this beautiful chandelier that's made of brass. And again, it's been depicted with this incredible detail. I mean, it really does. Look at the way the light is reflecting off the metal, and it really does seem, like it kind of gleams like the way metal would. A form of disguised symbolism, you might notice that there's only one candle lit. And this is supposedly symbolizing the unity of marriage taking place under one God. Let me go back. The illusionism of the painting was considered remarkable for its time, and part of the rendering of the detail, but particularly for the use of light to evoke space in an interior. So we're going to look at this diagram, and it's really very convincing, the depiction of the room, as well as the people who inhabit. So some scholars believe that Van Eyck might have used something called a camera obscura, which is an optical device that led to photography in the camera. The device consisted of a box or a room with a hole in one side. Light from an external scene passes through the hole and strikes the surface inside, where it's reproduced. Rotated 180 degrees, so it's upside down, but with color and the perspective preserved. The image can be projected onto paper and can then be traced to produce a highly accurate representation. And so some scholars think that perhaps he might have used this device. Others think that he might have used the device and maybe collaged different views together. So getting back to the actual portrait, again, I want you to really note this use of descriptive detail. I mean, look at this sort of carved woodwork, and again, the detail of it and the texture of the broom. So Van Eyck really did take advantage of the longer drying times of oil paint compared to tempera, to blend colors. So it was this sort of technique called wet into wet. And this achieved subtle variations in light and shade to heighten the illusion of three-dimensional forms. The medium of oil paint also permitted Van Eyck to capture the surface appearance and distinguish textures precisely. So I think we can really see that. I mean, her skin is very smooth and very translucent. We see this really beautiful detail of the headdress that she's wearing. The sort of lace detail is rendered very precisely, and then again the woodwork and the broom. And even like this sort of trim, looks like fur on her dress, is extraordinary. Something that also has been interesting to art historians is this mirror depicted in the back that is used to sort of reflect the space back, it's really interesting sort of playing with this idea of reality, or this idea of a painting depicting something real, and then you have this mirror image depicting what's in the painting or what was happening, or a different part of the scene. And so anyway, it's sort of an interesting object for art historians. They have commented on the sort of unusual geometric sort of orthogonal perspective that has been sort of created by this sort of fisheye, or the use of this mirror. And also we see that it is also signed. We talked about this with Van Eyck's self-portrait, that it was unusual for artists to sign their work, but this is also showing you that, the identity of the artist and sort of the self-awareness that artists were starting to have in terms of their talent and sort of their place in time. So it has been signed by Van Eyck, and in the reflection, we see some other figures that we couldn't see before, and it appears that there are two witnesses that are also in the room. Some other miniaturist detail are, I'll try to zoom in, are these sort of little miniature paintings depicted on the frame of the mirror. They're these little tiny medallions, and they're depicting the Passion of Christ. There's also these crystal prayer beads hanging next to the convex mirror, and this is supposed to imply the couple's piety. And the mirror is also supposed to represent a symbol of the all-seeing eye of God. Looking back at this as a portrait, Northern painters, their skill with oil painting, the oil painting medium, was also used to their great advantage in sort of this resurgence of interest in personal portraiture. As prosperous patrons commissioned both sort of isolated images of just their head, and then sort of larger compositional full-figured portraits such as this one that had more of a context to it. And when we look closely, I'm going to zoom in again at Arnolfini's face, we really do get a sense of a personal likeness than anything we've seen in Western art since ancient Rome. So, I mean, it really is easy to believe that this probably is what Arnolfini looked like. And so this is something that that we talked about with Roman portrait busts, Republican busts, this idea of historical specificity. So there's a lot of speculation about exactly what this portrait is. Is it a portrait of a couple that have just gotten married? What is the context of it? And there are different interpretations. One influential art historian named Erwin Panofsky, and I'm probably saying that wrong, he did a sort of a classic interpretation, and he tried to secure the identification of the couple portrayed in the painting. Obviously, he was able to attribute the male to Giovanni Arnolfini, who was a wealthy merchant from Lucca living in Brugge, and his wife, Giovanni Sinami, who was the daughter of a prosperous Italian banking family in Northern Europe that had many transactions occurring in Northern Europe. Based on what he knew about the painting and his identification of the people it represented, he proposed that this was a visual document of the couple's wedding, and that's what I was taught when I learned about this this painting very long ago in my art history class, in which the artist served as a witness. So, going back to the mirror image as well, some people think that one of the witnesses is Van Eyck himself, and this is attributed to the signature, sort of attributing to that fact. Again, but this is speculation. And that's sort of the sort of common understanding of this work, but there has been additional research that has sort of changed the interpretation as well. Additional research has also uncovered several men named Giovanni Arnolfini living in Brugge at the time. There was another individual named Giovanni de Arrigo Arnolfini, and this is who Panofsky believed was represented here. He did not marry Giovanni Sinami until 1447, more than a decade after the date in the artist's signature. Many now believe that the man is Giovanni di Nicola Arnolfini, documented in Brugge by 1419, and married in 1426 to the 13-year-old Costanza Trenta, who died a year before Van Eyck signed the painting. Another art historian named Margaret Coster has proposed that the double portrait was a memorial commissioned by Arnolfini to commemorate the loss of his wife. The lack of individuality in the face of the woman, the man's sober clothing, and the sort of funerary association of the dog in the foreground form part of her evidence. So again, this is another interpretation. Another interpretation, again, are the many aspects of how this double portrait proclaims the wealth and status of this couple. So some historians think it might be a portrait to display their class and their status and sort of their wealth. They're outfitted in extravagant clothing and surrounded by luxury objects, the lavish bed, hangings, there's that sumptuous chandelier, their precious oriental carpets, again, the sort of unseasonal fruit. The man wears a fur-lined silk velvet tunic, and the woman's gown not only employs more costly wool fabric than was necessary to cover her slight body, but its elaborate cut work, which we kind of see here, decorated right here too at the sleeves. There's also this sort of white fur lining around some of the edges of her clothing, and again, this was probably considered very ostentatious. And so some art historians think that this is sort of the yuppie couple of the 15th century. And so that's another interpretation. Even the little perky dog might not just be a symbol of fidelity, but could actually be a pet, a family pet that the couple owned. And again, choosing a rare sort of ornamental breed for inclusion in this portrait may have been yet another opportunity to express wealth. So what you're looking at now is a portrait, a double portrait, a photography image of Donald Trump. I thought it would be interesting to show this, considering what's happening with current events, and his first wife, Ivanka Trump. And so this is taken during the 80s, and I had mentioned this idea that going back, let me see if I can, this idea of a yuppie. So a yuppie was this sort of educated, college-educated, younger professional that had a job, had lots of money, was able to live in a big city. And so just so you understand that term, and then sort of maybe how this portrait is similar to the image of Annie Leibowitz's portrait, the double portrait done by of Donald Trump and Ivanka. So here I think you can really make some interesting comparisons. It's interesting, obviously they're sort of displaying their lavish wealth and, they're dressed very ostentatiously in this sort of fine clothing. And so this could be a really interesting sort of compare and contrast to make. But I thought it would be sort of interesting to kind of show you a double portrait from the 15th century and then a modern day portrait. And they're really not too far removed from each other. So our next work that we're going to be looking at is another altarpiece, which was done by Matthew Grunwald. This is known as the Eisenheim altarpiece. It was done between 1510 and 1515. So let's think about some of the characteristics of painting, the painting style that we've noted so far. So lots of surface detail and description. We'll look more closely at this altarpiece so we can see some of that. North Renaissance artists were obsessed with complexity and trying to show everything. With early North Renaissance art, there's not as much concern for canonical proportions of the figure, as well as this sort of illusionistic one-point perspective that early Italian Renaissance and obviously later Italian Renaissance artists would be obsessed with. So this is a very complex altarpiece. It opens in many different ways, which was a very typical sort of North European altarpiece. This particular altarpiece was commissioned for a hospital specializing in skin conditions. This is another view of it as it's been opened up a bit. This was an enormous movable altarpiece, and it was really meant to be an object of devotion in the Isenheim Hospital. It was built by the brothers of St. Anthony, and St. Anthony was the patron saint of those suffering from skin diseases. So again, this would make sense that this would be in a hospital that catered to those sorts of patients. So this is the same altarpiece. So I just want to make clear that we're looking at the same altarpiece. It's just very complex and opens up in different ways. So at the Isenheim Hospital, the Antonian monks devoted themselves to the care of sick and dying peasants. And many of these peasants suffered from the effects of ergotism, a disease caused by consuming rye grain infected with fungus. Ergotism, was popularly known as St. Anthony's fire. It was known to cause hallucinations, skin infection, and attack the central nervous system, eventually leading to death. What you're looking at here, this was not done by Van Eyck, are the sculpted wood altars portion of the altarpiece. And this was done by Nicholas of Hagenuus. You don't have to know about this part, but it's the central part of the altarpiece when it is opened up and carved, and it's gilded. And the style is much different, and it is important for you to note this. And it's definitely more Gothic, I think, in style. So I didn't want to focus too much on the wood portion. So we're really going to focus more on the painted pieces done by Van Eyck. I'm sorry, not Van Eyck, Grunwald. I'm so sorry. Please note that correction. This is Matthew Grunwald. He painted the panels, and what he was depicting were these sort of different visions of hell on earth, in which the physical and the psychological torments the afflicted Christ and a host of saints are rendered as visions wrought in this sort of dissonant psychedelic color. I'm sorry, I meant to be talking about this portion of the altarpiece when I was talking about the psychedelic colors and sort of the distorted figures here that he's sort of playing around with. And so, I mean, obviously we see, here's sort of the visitation or the Annunciation scene here. And we also have this really beautiful figure of Christ. We'll look at that in more detail as well. And what we do want to look at, though, is that this panel folds out to reveal this horrific sort of nighttime crucifixion. And this is where we're going to focus most of our attention. So here we have this crucifixion scene in the center panel. The flanking panels depict Saint Sebastian, long known as a plague saint because of his body, poked by arrows. And then Saint Anthony Abbot over here, who was the patron saint of those suffering from skin diseases. The pig who usually accompanies him in art is a reference to the use of pork fat to heal skin infections. I'm sorry, this is what I was talking about here. Or no. Where's the pig? He's somewhere in there. At the bottom, this is known as a predella, is the lamentation of Christ. We see this sort of sprawling and horrifyingly punctured dead body of Christ. And again, it's presented as an invitation to contemplate morality and resurrection. So, getting back to this depiction of saints St. Anthony Abbot, he is usually depicted with a pig, but it's not depicted here. I just wanted to make that correction. So let's look closely at the central panel. And this is sort of a really disturbing vision of Christ. It's very macabre, and we see that the figure is very distorted. Christ displayed on the cross, his hands, are very expressive. They almost seem to be sort of writhing in agony. His body is marked with livid spots of pox. The Virgin swoons in the waiting arms. Oh, sorry, this is the Virgin. Swoons in the waiting arms of the young St. John the Evangelist, while John the Baptist on the other side, who is usually not commonly depicted at the crucifixion, gestures towards the suffering body at the center and holds a scroll which reads, "He must increase, but I must decrease." The empathetic physical suffering was intended to be this idea of performing a miracle, a point of identification for the patients of the hospital. So the way they're portraying Christ like this, because a lot of these patients were suffering from these sort of horrific skin diseases, and so this would probably make this figure of Christ more accessible to them, and they could see themselves in this figure as well. So the idea here is that this sort of the patients would have this sort of empathy for this sort of horrible physical suffering that Christ is obviously going through, and this was intended to be thaumaturgic. I'm probably saying that wrong. I'm going to spell it for you: thaumaturgic, which again I mentioned earlier was miracle performing. And so this was again meant to be a point of identification for patients of the hospital. Patients would be comforted by seeing a Christ that looks like them. So here we're going to look at some details. Christ is not as idealized. Here, the North European version, he has sores and is decayed. His flesh looks decayed. Italian depictions often were more idealized. So I hope you remember this. This is one of the works we looked at by Masaccio with early Italian Renaissance painting. And I think you can definitely see that the Christ definitely is a lot more idealized and not as horrific looking as the North European version. And so, these might be two that you could compare and contrast. This wasn't officially on your list, but I did teach it to you, so I would probably go back and look that over and maybe keep those two works in your head in terms of maybe a free response question that you might encounter on the AP exam. So here's some other details, so you can really just see how gruesome this painting is. So we see Christ's sort of gruesome, painful death depicted with, again, this treatment of surface details. It's extremely descriptive. I mean, these feet and the sores and sort of the blood and just, it's really sort of heart-wrenching, I think, to look at. And when you think about the crucifixion, I mean, it was probably one of the most horrible ways to be put to death. So when we go back to the panels that are reflecting here the resurrection and the Annunciation, it sort of emphasizes this promise of resurrection. And so, these people who are suffering the way Christ is suffering, these patients with these awful skin diseases, could hope, in the afterlife to have this sort of resurrection and be sort of freed from these sort of earthly horrors that were plaguing them. And so here you have this really beautiful depiction of Christ, which is very unusual. I've never really seen one like this before, with this really bright sort of sun-like orb, and the way he's really bathed in this golden light. Again, quite extraordinary in terms of the surface detail and descriptive detail of the painting and the surface. The resurrection panel depicts Christ wreathed in this sort of orange orb, red, and he sort of has a sort of red and yellow sort of body halo, and rises like a streaking fireball, hovering over the bodies of these sleeping soldiers. And so it's a combination of transfiguration and resurrection and ascension, which are these various narratives of sort of the resurrection of Christ. This depiction of Christ's resurrection would have been a sign of hope for the patients in the hospital, and this is how they would have been rewarded in the afterlife. So I'm going to stop here. We do have a few more works to talk about, and we will be looking at those in part 3 of North Renaissance painting. I also wanted you to note as well that we have also moved from the 1400s into the 1500s as well. So in part 3, we're going to be looking at sort of the later period of the Renaissance in North European art. And then we're going to travel back to Italy and look at the later Renaissance. We only talked about the early Renaissance in the segment before Christmas break, and we'll get back and talk about the later Renaissance during the 15th and 16th century in Italy. So stay tuned for part 3.